Welcome to arc.dev's remote career success week, where we learn how to land your dream job from those who've done it. And I am your host, Brandon. I'm the creative producer for Be Spoonified and a friend of arc.dev, a platform connecting software developers everywhere with remote opportunities. And I have the pleasure to be here with Megan Murphy, the VP of Product at Hotjar. And Hotjar is a self-funded, profitable, and fully distributed company on a mission to help you better understand how users behave on your website. Megan joins us to chat about her experience, and we are excited because she's going to be letting us know how sticking your values can lead to your dream job. Megan, thank you for being with us. As we know, this is a remote conference and it is late at night where you are. So we appreciate you taking the time to chat with us and all of the attendees that are going to be with this festival and this conference that's going on right now.
Thanks for having me.
So Megan, thank you so much for joining us tonight, for where you are. Typically what we do is that we, standard SIPR procedures, that is, an introduction is done for all of the presenters and the interviewees. But today, because it's a job seeking conference, we wanted to go ahead and change it up a little bit and make it more of an interview style. So we want to start with that first question that everybody starts with when they're in an interview is, can you tell me a little bit about yourself? And also, could you give an example of your own 30-second elevator pitch?
I can try. The simplest things are always actually the hardest, right? Yes. Cool. So yeah, my pitch would be, hi, I'm Megan. I'm the VP of Products at Hotjar, and I am relentlessly curious. Like painfully insomnia-inducing prisoner of my curiosity, kind of curious, where whether it's falling into product by accident, which is true, or the roles I've chosen since, or the countries I've moved to, or 8 years into my career deciding to pursue a master's in design school, I think the only thread of consistency is really my curiosity. And so I've never had a master plan, and I probably never will. So my story only makes sense when I tell it, because it exposes why I've made the choices to pursue what I have and what I've wanted to learn along the way.
Oh my gosh. And the great thing about, listening to all these conversations, and especially we were talking to Katie and a few other of our presenters, is that, the curiosity brought them to this point. Like you're saying just now, you're curious, relentlessly curious, because there's no really specific one pathway, one journey to get to the point where you are now. And that actually is a great interlude into our next question is, why did you decide to pursue a remote product management career? And then maybe what are some of the factors that led you, or maybe what's that redefining moment that you had that you were like, you know what, time to change, and you kind of just skyrocketed from there? Yeah.
So I think I've in honesty, in the pursuit of my career, I would decouple the decision to work in a remote context and to work in product as two separate ones. I think I'm just really happy that I've been able to blend them together. So in terms of product management, I mean, like I mentioned earlier, I fell into it by accident. I was working at Microsoft as a project manager years ago in San Francisco. And like any good millennial living in San Francisco in the early 2010s, I was like, I got to jump this corporate ship. It's not for me. I need to work on something that's aligned with my values. And so I went to a 23-person startup. I remember 23 because they gave me a Jordan jersey when I joined. And yeah, I joined this startup, this mission-driven like health tech startup, trying to democratize access to solid, sound, medically approved, but like very modern nutrition advice. And the only way it was a B2B startup, and the only way that I could really joined them was to figure out how to land big enterprise clients, which was not my dream at all. But I was so focused on the mission that I was like, I'll do whatever job I need to if I can do something that really speaks to me. And so in order to win this deal with a big client, they were like, yeah, you have to build a product for them. And so that's kind of how I got into product. And once I did, I recognized that I'd found something that spoke to me that wasn't so clear cut. It wasn't like, for me, project management was not a good fit. It was very much based on timelines and budgets. And I'm not great on either of those things in my personal or professional life. I won't pretend. So it took me a couple of years out of my bachelor's degree to find my groove. And then from there, every step along the way has really been about, what do I want to learn next, right? So once I decided that the smaller company fit was way better for me, then it was, how can I build more products? Where am I going to do that? So that's what I did next. And then it was not just, how can I ship stuff out? It was, how can I have more ownership over this? How can I have longevity and build for the longer term and experiment at scale and learn what it's like to optimize a product experience? And that's what, drove my Skyscanner chapter. And then from there, it was, how do I lead teams, and how do I become a great leader, and how do I, be the leader I always wished I had, and respect individual contributors in their work and give them autonomy and direction, because the two only work if they're hand in hand. Yeah. And so I think all of that is really important context, because personally, I kind of felt like I was never a good fit in an office environment. Don't get me wrong, I've made plenty of great friends and connections and colleagues I really respect in the office. But the truth is that I've never had a good idea sitting at somebody else's desk. I can sit there and do operational stuff. I can have calls, but in terms of like ideas and how to bring them to life, I don't personally like find that easy if I'm sitting somewhere between certain hours. And so I always wanted to take control over that. But I always felt like working remotely was sort of like working in this offsite universe on your own, where everybody else is in person and you're just the one out there by yourself. And so I feel like, what a time to be alive, that we can decouple where we work and what work we do. And so with that becoming more and more of an option, especially in the wake of COVID kind of accelerating this, but my choice to go remote was slightly before COVID hit. I'm really proud that I've been able to find a way to still grow in my career and do so in a path that I've kind of carved out for myself, with this curiosity taking me to wherever I want to go. But doing so on my own schedule, designing my own life, like feeling very in control of, I want to go for a run in the middle of the day. Or I made a joke earlier about insomnia, but I do have a lot of trouble sleeping, hence why it's past midnight for me here talking to you right now. So the fact that I just have a bit more ownership on designing my life and how my day is spent is what's compelled me to pursue the blending of these two things, the remote path and growing in product.
And it's interesting you say that. I was listening to one of your previous conversations, and you really kind of gave us a definition of this vocabulary, the word called trend, right? Which is the same sustained manifestation of change. And so listening to your story now, it's almost, you're putting into perspective of, okay, being in this, millennial mindset of really understanding, what I need to get in order to change my life trajectory, or to be able to ask these questions. Because, in the current environment that you were, when you look at the enterprise environmental factors, the culture wasn't matching, the structure of how you wanted to go about your day, how you wanted to organize those things. You're like, I need to pivot a little bit. I need to institute an idea or a philosophy of change so that I can change where I want to go. And so it's great to kind of see how that has augmented and enveloped and blossomed your path now to where you are as a VP in product. And that can kind of, is a great segue to our next question, is looking at, okay, with this change, with this, bite of curiosity, with this excitement of looking for something better, looking for something more unique, giving yourself the platform to ask more questions, how did you go about your job, or your process of finding your current job, and then also translating that to your application process as well?
Sure. So in pursuit of my current opportunity, I think it's a combination of two things. One, I always try to, and I always encourage those I care about and those on my teams to not run away from things, but to run toward something else. And I think that they can happen at the same time, right? But sometimes if you're running away from something, you can be kind of blinded into what you run into because you're so desperate to get out of whatever you're doing, right? So for me, in my last chapter at a previous employer right before I joined Hotjar, I felt a disconnect in what I wanted to do in the job I thought I should be doing in service to my team from the one that I was expected to do. And that was just something I couldn't live with. And I think, I'm really lucky that I have been confronted to face my values. I know that's a topic we'll dive into as well. Like, sometimes we don't think about that. You don't think about, am I working in a way that's consistent with my values? Like, unless anything is just like categorically awful,
Yeah.
At the worst case, often we feel indifferent, right? Like, I feel okay with this, right? Like, I worked at Skyscanner before, which I'm very proud of. But the truth is that if I think about the environmental impact of like making travel cheaper, am I okay with that? I was indifferent while I was there. I might have a different opinion now, but that's okay. Like, I accept that. And in my last role, I felt like I had this unique opportunity where I had, kind of carved out a name for myself by living up to my reputation and cultivated a network that was there for me. And so I had the luxury of choosing where to go next. What I ended up doing was making a really long list of what I didn't want. And that helped me create a really short list of, I called it my tiny yes list, a really short list of what I did want. And for specifics, for anybody who's curious, the things I did want were really humble founders who've proven themselves and who've done this before or have a sustainable business. I wanted a place without investors and a very aggressive board trying to steer the ship without really being on the ground operating and understanding the very climate we're operating in. So I wanted to go somewhere bootstrap because I just thought it was really cool to learn from a place that has actually proven out profitability early on and isn't like, the tail wagging the dog with investors. I wanted to go somewhere where the feeling was authentic, right? And so the proxy that I used for that was, how are the Glassdoor reviews? But that's just a proxy because that's imperfect. So I think that for me, that was more like a screening. And then I thought, okay, what am I going to test for when I'm in these interviews? So I would ask questions like, tell me the last time you disagreed with your boss. How'd it go? What was the outcome? And I would treat these interviews as a two-way street because I believe they are. And it doesn't matter, in my opinion, it doesn't matter what kind of seniority or if you're just getting started or not. It's always a two-way fit. It's not a one-way. And so this short yes list led me to find very few companies that were fully remote, bootstrapped, profitable, humble founders, good cultural index. And I just happened to strike some luck in that Hotjar reached out to me. So I'm very grateful for that. And it is like, I think that a lot of our success we should be able to attribute to when there was luck and things we can't account for. And this is one of them for me right now.
Yeah, and it's so great that you created a dialogue in these interviews with the companies that they were seeking you, and because you said earlier you're millennial, and I'm a millennial, Generation Y, I think they call it now as well, and the mindset of kind of being in those spaces where you take the job, you go for it, you're there, you're just dealing with all the crap that comes with it because you're looking for longevity and those factors which we will talk about a little bit later in the interview, you kind of put to the side because you're looking to be there for 10 or 15 years. Now that whole kind of vernacular and that idea of thinking has changed, right? Especially within the tech world, you have people that are in jobs for 6 months to a year maybe, and then they're transitioning because things are changing and they're kind of being with the times. And it's so great that you bring up the fact of when you're going on these interviews, you have to remember that they're interviewing you and you're interviewing them, because at the same time, you have to be comfortable in order to sow seed into being a productive and so the seeds of productivity within your work. And kind of staying on that lane a little bit before we jump, because I'm a huge D&I person, and inclusivity and also accessibility are things that I, as an individual, hold value when I look at companies as well. But before we go into that, you set a point of asking interview questions for the person, and the interview questions that you have sat with them. Can you maybe list out what some of those interview questions that you did ask, and how did you answer? But then on the flip side, the interview questions that they asked you and how you answered those questions as well. So to kind of get that conversation of back and forth going.
Yeah, I think first of all, the interview process at Hotjar is really unique. And so there's ample opportunity for dialogue, whether it's me as a candidate who's curious, or not now, but back then, right, when I was a candidate, or the employer is asking me who I am. And so I think that one thing in a remote career context is that by nature of being remote, you essentially remove almost all opportunities for spontaneity. And that is not something to be ignored. And so I think finding natural touch points to connect with people in a context that's not so formal, in a context that's not so specific, is often missing. So in our interview process at Hotjar, we have a very unique process where basically the candidate, if they make it to one of the late rounds, they sign an NDA, and then they get full access to Slack channels, dashboards of data, strategy docs, artifacts, whatever they want, right? Yeah. So we give them this NDA, a problem space and some context, and then say, here's Hotjar, come meet us, come talk to us. And so because of that, and at the end of the process, whether the candidate is hired or not, we compensate them for their time, because we recognize that all candidates' time is valuable. And if we bring candidates in to do such a heavy lifting kind of task, we sure as hell need to compensate them, because it's only fair.
Right.
So with that said, I think that gave me such an opportunity to have an interesting dialogue. So I would ask questions like I just told you. Tell me the last time you disagreed with your manager. How did it go? Mm-hmm. What were the outcomes? Or I would ask questions like, what's the best thing about communication at Hotjar, and what's the worst thing? Right? And then these things would start to naturally kind of unfold. And I would also ask very specific things grounded in reality. So not, can you think of a time when, but more like, last month, what was the hardest problem you had to solve? Or last quarter, did you reach your objectives? If yes, great, how'd it go? If no, why not? Tell me about that. What were your challenges there? So I think just like keeping in mind the bigger picture, where are we going and why? What do you think is the purpose? I think as a candidate, you can learn a lot when you ask some tangible questions about last quarter. And you can also learn about a lot when you ask existential questions. Like, for example, I asked, why is Hotjar better suited to win business than XYZ competitors? And if there's not a clear answer to that, it indicates to me that there's not enough reflection. And that's okay. That's not a deal breaker. And that's not a red flag to me. It means I want to look for the humility that they're open to doing the work and the thinking that it takes in order to have I won't curse, sorry, have an excellent answer to that question. I got myself.
It's like, the passion is there. and that's such a good way to kind of look at it, because, and mind you, I guess my first personal question is, the business model of having access, right? Going to that point of accessibility, like, is that standard in companies now that you've kind of witnessed, or is that something that Hotjar is doing specifically to have them, to make them unique in this process, for the interview process for candidates?
I am not familiar with others who have a process quite like Hotjar's. So, I don't keep active tabs so much. I think that you're speaking at this event in general is full of some really awesome leaders from great remote brands out there, honestly. So I don't know their interview processes in and out, but I do know that as a remote native company for 6, almost 7 years, Hotjar's had the time to go through what works and what doesn't work, and where we've landed now is something where I think like we get really high quality candidates, and the ones who make it until that final round are typically like in it to win it, right? Because you have to commit in order to go through a process like that. So to my knowledge, this is a Hotjar thing, but I'm ready and willing to see the rest of the industry prove me wrong and show that this is becoming more the norm.
You heard that, guys? We're going to put that out. We're make that a tweet. Thank you, Megan, for that. And it's so great to see the change, right? Because Hotjar is now, from my understanding, is I haven't seen that process before. So it's so enlightening that, Hotjar is a company that honors where the individuals are, honors them in the interview process, and really, recognizes them, and kind of like we're in the time now of the we see you, in a motto and in a way of understanding the time, the preparation, the skill, the stress, the mental stress that, going through a job process has. And then that actually really is a really good segue for us to, now dive into, the values and experience conversation, right? And so looking at kind of the values, right, that we're having and we're doing, the next question we want to dive in is, can you share more about how your personal values have guided you in your career path? How did they affect your decision to apply for and leave certain jobs? And what role did this play in landing, your job at Hotjar, which I think you mentioned a little bit before, but we'd love to kind of see the full circle and the storyline connect together.
Sure. I'll take you on a rapid journey of where things started. So I'm originally from New York, And like any good New Yorker, I thought that my destiny was to go work on Wall Street, which is exactly what I did in the midst of the financial crisis, despite the financial crisis coming out of undergrad. And it took me a very short amount of time to recognize that that was not for me. And so that was my segue into tech. I'm grateful that that was pretty early on. And then I realized that while tech as an industry felt a bit more in line with my interests, it was less about my values at that time. My decision to move to a place, like I said, the difference between running away and running toward, my decision to run toward something for a feeling of my values, or maybe more my purpose back then, was that 23-person startup, the health tech startup. And I think that was a great signal for me. In truth, I took a substantial pay cut, and living in San Francisco, that was not an easy thing to do. But I thought anything is worth it if I'm interested in the topic and it speaks to me. So making that move at a relatively young age and a green stage of my career, and going from something so established, like I think it's also easy when your friends and family just hear a brand name and they're like, oh, you work at insert big name here, whether it's tech or not. And then you leave that to do something they've never heard of and something they couldn't fathom. And then they're like, why are you jumping off to make less money at a smaller brand name? And you don't know if they're going to be in business for the next 6 months. And you're like, well, hell, I'm on a journey. That's why. And our parents do the things that, they do the things so that we can do the things they didn't do. But then once we do them, they're like, why are you doing that? So I think I just really relished in that, making this conscious decision for myself to go somewhere that spoke to me. And so that was earlier on. And more recently, as I described, I made a decision to leave somewhere that I felt like it wasn't consistent with my values. And that, confronting that, when I say not consistent with my values, an example of that is the discipline of product management is a nascent discipline compared to its peers in engineering and design, who've had more formalized education programs, formalized career paths, formalized intros and segues into the career than product historically. And as a result, working in product management, the whole premise is that you're entrusted with prioritization and articulating why and why not decisions are made, and lots of other things, but those things are really, really core. And so because of that, in my career as an individual contributor, working as a product manager, building, I built iOS and Android apps and Apple TV apps and Samsung Gear VR headset apps, and just so many cool apps and so many cool products that I'm very proud of. But the joy of that was because I was entrusted to make these decisions, make the priorities, and explain why, and articulate myself. And so that's really fundamental to the discipline. And so working in an environment prior to Hotjar, where the expectation of my role was very different and more to go deliver on something else that was, ideas that were unproven, not validated with data, not backed up by customer research or customer support tickets. I think customer support is such a rich, gold mine of ideas and indicators of customer sentiment that we need to tap into as product managers. And to see that was not the modus operandi and didn't show any signs of it, frankly, I just could not bring myself to be a leader of a product team without respecting all the things that I would have wanted as an individual contributor. And so that was the fundamental thing that made me say, I will only go somewhere where I give my team, each PM, the room to make mistakes, the guardrails for good decision-making, the support to go learn and stretch themselves, the accountability, whether things go right or wrong. I have to give them that. And that was one of the things that brought me to Hotjar. And Hotjar, in terms of living its values, I think the proverbial values written on the wall is something, considering very few of us are surrounded by the same walls anymore. It's often just a saying on a wall. And that is not what I wanted. I needed to go somewhere that was walking the talk. And so when I learned that Hotjar actually does performance reviews based on how well somebody embodies its 5 core values, which are public, by the way, they're on our public team manual and a Confluence page. When I see that the way our performance is assessed is how well did you learn by doing? How well did you work with respect? What are examples where you were bold and move fast? What are examples where you built trust through transparency? The fact that we actually hold people accountable to living our values during every performance review, I hear people say those things I just listed out daily. And that during my interview process, like I said, since I had so many touch points, I was just struck by how can a place operate like this? This is very special. And that's more the full story, like make a change in pursuit of my values, recognize when I was not in conditions that were aligned with them, and then make sure that that was actually the most important thing in choosing where I went next.
I'm full right now. And it's so interesting too, is that, so for Hotjar, they made it pretty much, it sounds like they made it very, it's almost like I think about looking in the glass house. All their walls are glass, so you can see kind of into the company and really be able to find it quickly. So as somebody that is looking in the state where they're saying, hey, I've been in these companies, I'm now pivoting myself not only for my career but also for my values. What are some of the tools that can they use to dig deeper for a company that isn't glass house as Hotjar? What are some of the ways that they can kind of get more of this information? It's
a great question. I think that, the proxy, like I said, Glassdoor specifically is not the perfect solution. There's no silver bullet, but I think that's a start, at least as a filter. Okay. And then I think even in very early interview questions or interview rounds with a recruitment team or with before you go on to more mature stages of interview processes, I think that asking questions like, can you give me an example of how your team exhibited transparency this week? Like, first of all, you got to ask yourself what your values are. So that's important, right? So that makes an assumption that people are in touch with those things, right? And we often feel like afraid to get into deep conversation with strangers. But when it comes to like knowing yourself, I think that's on every candidate and that's on every person.
Step one.
Once you know those things, step one. And then once you know those things, going through these interviews, don't be afraid to ask questions. When were you transparent with the team you lead last week? Stuff like that. Those will give you early indicators. And even if it sounds like a dream job on paper, but then in the real talk, in the real discussions, you're not seeing consistent evidence that your values are really present and embodied there. Listen, tech is a hot market. I think you could find somewhere else because I think it's too much to sacrifice.
And is there any, for me, by writing down your values, is that having your, Oprah moment where you're just kind of letting it out? Or is there maybe smaller ways or smaller resources or blogs that you found that help you really identify, that pivot and change that you can share with some of the attendees that are listening today?
To find those companies in the first place, you mean?
Yeah. Is there any blogs or is there any kind of literature that can help this person almost create like a roadmap of being, okay, this is your values. You've identified what your values are. Okay, here's a roadmap on kind of how to make sure that your values are your values. Because sometimes, we have the opportunity where we're have the impression by other people's and other factors in life, but you kind of honing that down for yourself and really finding out where those companies are. Like, is there any blogs that you tapped into early on in your career where you're like, okay, this is a resource that I can use and this is a way that I can really get advice to move forward with?
Understood. Yeah. So I think in a way, social proof carries a lot of weight. So if you're someone that I trust, when you tell me a recommendation, I would probably trust you more than if I had just stumbled upon it in a search on my own. So there are blogs I follow. Like most people working in product these days, I follow closely what Marty Kagan and the Silicon Valley Product Group put out. So when they make references to other companies who are actually walking the walk on strong product management culture, strong product leadership, solid principles, effective strategies. Like when they reference other materials, I probably over-index on trust there because I've been a consistent consumer of their content for the better part of a decade. So that's one example. I can't say that my recommendations on content alone will be enough to carry that weight. I know, I don't know if you're familiar with Lenny's newsletter. There's a guy named Lenny. He has a newsletter. It's excellent. He's an early Airbnb employee. So he was on the growth team at Airbnb for 7 years. Right. And he curates this excellent content and uses his own network across Twitter and LinkedIn, and probably other networks that are way too cool for me right now. And he puts questions out there and has other leaders in tech respond. And then he curates content for a weekly newsletter using the responses of people in his own network. And so because I'm a consumer of his paid newsletter, he has a free one too, by the way, I put more trust in, oh, okay, this person is doing that. Same thing with podcasts. Like I love Masters of Scale. So anything that I'm hearing on Masters of Scale, specifically, like not just the big names, but when they do these small, like here's this other small example applied in real life by a Series A startup or a 30-person company, things that are a bit more relatable than big scale enterprise podcast interview subjects. Like I'm listening there, but I must say there's no one source, right? It's me making sense of all the signals out there, figuring out who I trust, who sounds like they're aligned with my values, and then following their content. It's a long game.
And thank you for that. Because and I didn't know of Lenny's, but I'm going to go ahead and look that up after this interview and really tap into that. And I know a lot of people in this chat right now, they're like, thank you so much. That's what we're looking for, the tidbits and the gems. And so, your journey of getting this information and looking at, using your real life experiences, using the real conversations you have, following these blogs, this really helped you in building a product that you can now use for your portfolio, or kind of using your time of developing your journey, your career path. So for those of us who are new to this, can you share specific examples of how and where to find an opportunity to make your own product, or to build these, real life experiences to building a product, so that we can, utilize these on our portfolios, or utilize these as skills that we can sell to companies so that they want us to be a part of their journey with them?
Yeah, there's a lot to say here. So I think for product management in general, there are plenty of boot camps and certificate programs out there. And as somebody who hires product managers, I am always pleased to see someone take the initiative to exhibit a lifelong learner, by taking the initiative to go out and do something like that, to sign up for a course. I've signed up recently for some language courses, and I've had such poor attendance that I really respect those who go through and like honor that, because my Catalan is terrible right now, trying to learn Catalan. And so anyway, I think those things are good for showing initiative. However, I don't think that they are applicable real life, hands-on, tangible experience in building products. And unless it's for a very junior role in product, it can't replace doing it yourself and learning by doing, right? So how does one do that? So I see a couple ways. One is using networks. For example, Co-Founders Lab. I signed up for Co-Founders Lab a few years ago. Just because I was interested in entrepreneurship is indeed like a goal of mine in the longer term. So I think trying to find somebody who has complementary skills there, right? Let's say that there are plenty of folks with technical backgrounds there. So finding somebody with a technical background who says, I know how to build this, I'm just struggling to figure out where to start. If you're an aspiring product manager and there's someone who has an idea they want to bring to life, and you want to find a real hands-on way to help shape that, you will indeed have the experience in setting priorities, setting goals, making decisions, recognizing which decisions are actually reversible and not that big a deal if you walk back and change course, because the reality is most decisions are reversible. It's just our ego that often gets in the way. And telling the story about it, communicating, explaining, like if you're a 2-person startup, okay, your communicating is going to be a talk, or like a Slack or WhatsApp or something, right? But you know what I mean? So you're going to have this practical experience to latch on to, and to live this story, and to have it with you forever. You're also, as a side effect, going to have something to talk about in an interview. So that's helpful. The second thing is it really depends on just how much you want to have this more cross-section generalist experience. So as a product manager, especially in an early stage company, there is a high chance that you, like everybody else in an early stage company, will be wearing many different hats throughout the day, just as I did when I was in a 20-person startup. And, you might need to design user flows and experiences. You might need to do some visual design. You might need to write some code. You might need to write some queries and user stories and marketing materials and app store descriptions and. The way that I think that that's possible is if you can find a way to scratch your own itch and build a product yourself. And I'm not saying this is the solution. I'm saying this is a solution, because getting a taste of each of these disciplines will also help you better empathize with those roles when you go out and work with designers and engineers and data analysts in the future. And so I think this is about 6 years ago, I recognized that I was just woefully underskilled in understanding the pain points and the challenges that my colleagues in front-end engineering in another company had. And so I decided to take a Swift 3 course, because I think Stanford made all of those open source. So I took this Swift 3 programming course, downloaded Xcode on my personal computer, and then just like Stack Overflowed my way to finding code that would stick together and work to build an app an iOS app that would tell me how much to tip when I was traveling. Because I've always found it difficult as somebody from the States, when you leave the States, and then gratuity is such a difficult thing to figure out. And I find myself accidentally offending everybody and giving them money. They're like, what are you doing? I'm going to make an app for this. In Brazil, it's I moved to Brazil before I moved to Spain, by the way. So in Brazil, it's only tip for this much on these occasions. And in Spain is this much. So I was like, you know what? That seems really easy. I don't have to do any complex database storage. So I learned how to write the code, or if I'm honest, Stack Overflow really taught me how to learn that. I learned how to produce some designs in Sketch, which is now irrelevant because the world has moved on to Figma. But whatever, the point is, I took the initiative to do this myself. I went in, had more empathy for my colleagues. They recognized and were like, yeah, you know what you're talking about, right? So it brought me that credibility. So I think even as a candidate, your destiny is in your hands. You can do these things. I would encourage more people to go do that and get that hands-on experience.
And even kind of talking to the hands-on experience and almost this whole kind of notion of this trial and error mindset. You did it earlier on. I was reading in your history of you came from a fashion world where that was an entrepreneurial opportunity you did of making beach bags and taking that and really going kind of through this trial and error of, okay, let me try something. If it doesn't work, let me switch it out. But let me also too have the flexibility and patience to go through the process, which is, when you're thinking about it, could be both a value, right, of persistence and making sure you have the passion, and then the experience of failing, achieving and failing and achieving. It's that back and forth. So I would love to hear more about that endeavor, if you would like to elaborate a little bit more, because it's almost, in a sense, Megan, is Steph Smith, who was with us earlier. She made this comment of having this T-shaped applicant, right, where you're really strong at one thing, but then at the top it kind of it streams out a little bit, and you have other skills and things that you can bring to the table, as far as people looking for you for information and resources and longevity, right? I think, hold on one second, Megan, I think you went mute.
Am I back?
Yes, you're back.
Okay, that was my bad. I promise I've done this before. So yeah, you've really done your homework, because that's not something I talk about too much or market. So the context for those joining us is that a couple of years ago, I decided to take what was a personal goal of mine to build something with my hands, right? So I think participating in the knowledge economy is indeed a luxury and something that I value very much, and is the basis of my career. However, like many people I've met who work in tech, there is nothing like doing something with your hands. And so I felt a huge curiosity to make an excuse to do that. And so I was going to design school here in Barcelona, and I was in a trend forecasting course about how do you basically make sense of the industry signals around you and channel them into something constructive that's very on trend, right? And so you started this discussion, Brendan, by mentioning my view on trends is a sustained manifestation of change. And I think that's a quick clarification for those here, is that when I say trend, I don't mean trendy, right? A trend is like a sustained line. This is not a trend. This is a bunch of spikes. So when I say trend, I don't mean like the fidget spinners that were in style in 2017 for all of like 30 something days, right? what I mean, I'm sure somebody got very wealthy from that, but at the cost of the environment, if I must say. So I thought I would challenge myself to make a physical product and leverage all the stuff I was learning in design school, which had nothing to do with fashion. And I don't have a background in fashion and not much of an interest. If you could see my pants, you would understand. So anyway, what I noticed was like, I had lived in California, I had lived in Brazil, I live in Barcelona now. And while three very different cultural places, a common denominator is just killer beach culture, which I like. So I kept noticing in all of these places around the world, including some of my travels, a lot of problems at the beach. And this is a very, like, for those interested in product management or getting into it, I hope you recognize the parity here, because I had noticed, for example, people pouring everything out of their beach bag and then pouring out all the sand, like shaking it, and then putting all their stuff back in. And I thought, that's terrible usability. That's a lot of wasted time and effort. And then I saw people putting a wet swimsuit in next to their book and then getting all the book pages wet. And I thought, well, that's terrible as well. Like, you don't want to ruin your book. Right. And likewise with your phone and your iPad. And I thought, well, that's bad. You're going to break your devices. And I saw also like beach bags on people really thin strapped. Your shoulders are the second thing to sunburn after your nose. So thin straps digging into your shoulders makes no sense under the hot sun, because it's going to hurt, and it does hurt. And so I just kept noticing all of these little things that I thought were just terrible usability problems about the beach experience generally. Again, in Spain, Brazil, and the US, I thought there's a common denominator here, no matter the continent. I can solve this by designing a better beach bag. And so I spent 7 months designing prototypes of beach bags, taught myself how to sew, which I literally had to Google or YouTube how to turn on sewing machine, literally, because I don't know how to do that. I didn't. Taught myself how to sew for 7 months, decided to bring on who's become a very close friend from design school as my co-founder to act as my designer. Wow. We made prototype after prototype, and eventually we built a supply chain. We found manufacturer, we found an importer, we found distribution channels, we designed our packaging, our website, our brand, our Instagram. We just built a product that solved a bunch of problems and made a business and a brand around it. And I'm really proud to say that after 2 years of work, a very big e-commerce company in the States bought up all my inventory and has gone on to sell them. So that's very exciting and rewarding that it was like a product that actually solved some problems. Yeah, that's totally on the side, outside of my real job, by the way.
I love it. And it goes back to your point of just that entrepreneurial spirit that you have within you, which is one of the values that you hold dear, when you're looking at a company, is being able to be that entrepreneur, that person to bring, address and acknowledge some issues and then bring solutions to the table. And so that is just, I kudos to you, Megan, and also to you guys. Take note. I'm going to try to, I know we're kind of tight on time a little bit, so I want to get through some other of these questions before we jump to the Q&A, but that's great. So I think that conversation there can actually lead into kind of our next thing of, can you list 3 soft skills to land a remote product management job?
Sure. So I think maybe these are a bit more general to like product management or related disciplines in the remote context. So the first one is like, use the tools at your disposal. So in an in-person interview, you might be at a loss for words, but you can think of something in your head. You can think of an app on your phone. You can think of an example you've seen. In a remote context, you have this magical ability to say, hey, could we jump into Miro for a second and I'll show you the thought pattern I have by showing you how I think? Or, hey, do you mind if I ping you this link so you can see this reference I'm talking about? Like, I think that the context of interviewing and working in a remote culture gives us the ability to, like, in a moment's notice, you can show someone and bring them along with you, especially if verbally, if it's just not coming out the way that you want to, and you want to bring them along with your narrative. The second one is recognizing that if you're meeting somebody for the first time or one of the first times, and you're in a very different context than they are, you likely have different interview speeds, a different cadence of talking, a different rhythm, and it takes time to get to know people. So as a candidate, especially, as anybody, but as a candidate especially, when you're talking to an interviewer, remember that if you don't know their cadence of speech, then you won't know when they're pausing and when they're done. And so if you jump in, right, you might totally unintentionally interrupt them, but it could be construed as like, oh, dude, I wasn't even done with the question, right? So just keep that in mind, and like using period and pause, taking a breath, letting someone finish. I think it's so much better to be a little bit more, like, give the benefit of the doubt that they might still have one more thing to say instead of jumping right in. Mm-hmm. And then the last thing I'd say is about, product as a discipline is really based on the ability to communicate well in so many different mediums. And as part of that communication, I think like developing a connection with somebody is really important. Saying like, I see you as a person. Let me talk to you as a person, not just, hi, how are you? Nice to meet you. Like, yeah, formalities are fine. Small talk is fine, but small talk is so much more meaningful when you get to know who somebody is. And so I always like to use the cues around me and ask questions. Like, for example, Brandon, you commented right when we met this evening, this afternoon, about my Zaha Hadid book, right? So that speaks to me because I'm like, okay, you see that. And if somebody says, oh, who's Zaha Hadid, which happened to me on Monday of this week, and then I get to say, you know what, a prolific architect whose career and whose life I just admire so much. Then you get to know a little bit about me. So I would say, like, use what's right in front of you to develop a human connection with somebody. Because if you don't do that, all the rest of the communication is going to just be so much harder.
And it's great too, because I read online the other day, one I forgot who said it, and I'm gonna look for it and I'll try to post it in the chat, guys. But there was one guy, one author, and they had mentioned knock before you enter, and it's so prolific just to hear you like offering up kind of the patience and the respect and knocking, in conversation, to making sure that they're done and respecting their space, because it put you guys on a kind of a foundation of acceptance and visibility and inclusivity and wrapping those in together. Megan, we can talk for hours because this conversation is so juicy. Sorry, I didn't mean to say juicy, but also too, with kind of looking at, what's your number one non-obvious tip for job seekers as well?
Yeah, I think for product managers, especially, your discipline and your success in this discipline will matter so much on the trust and the bond that you build with your team, right? Because the nature of the job, a product manager is going to be useless without the disciplines it works with, right? And brings ideas to life with, just like any of the disciplines. But that said, I think in a remote context, like, you need to show that you can really rally your team around your ideas, around your evidence, around your narrative. And, in a remote environment, repetition is key, even more than in person. So don't assume that just because you wrote, like, let's say there's an internal blog, or you have a CV, or you have some like written way of communicating with someone. Don't assume that if you write it once, it sticks. That's not how we work. That's not how our species works. We need repetition. We need to see consistency. And so I think that showing ways of building a bond with your team, getting your message across, I think doing that is really, really important. As a candidate, you can talk about how you've done this in a remote context before, or if you haven't, then talk about ideas and how you might, right? So like I said earlier, the remote context often zaps the spontaneity out of our work. So what are the organic touch points that you can create and you can cultivate with your team to get their trust and have these organic conversations with them? I think that's super important. So for example, in my team, every other Wednesday, the product team, we order lunch, which we can expense on our team budget, and we spend our lunch time looking at the last 7 days of incoming feedback from customers to us about our product. And this is a relatively organic discussion because we could never predict what the customers are going to say, right? Like, there are patterns over time, sure, but we're fostering this sense of like relentlessly looking at what customers are saying and keeping a pulse on them and doing so together in an organic format. And I'm trying to accomplish many things here. One, truly amplify the voice of the customer. Two, make sure the product managers know what's top of mind for them. But also, let's not forget, I'm trying to build a sense of team around some common pain point or some common goal that we have. And so if I were a candidate in a remote environment, or like, trying to go into a remote company, I would explain, I have found ways to rally a team and be together and like bond over something where we have this common denominator. And here's an example. I think that that's really, really important because it can be done outside of the confines of an office. You just have to think about it and make an intention.
And that's a great segue into our next question is, what role does your network play? Which I think we had a little bit of a sprinkle of conversation of that topic there. And then also, how do you approach making new connections remotely?
Sure. So I think in terms of the role that my network plays, this is easier said than done. And I don't mean to be, I don't mean to sound antisocial. I do find energy from solo time. Like I do identify as an introvert for the most part. I think that being selective with your network is just as important as being selective with your relationships and how you spend your time. And so there might be people you meet socially who you're like, yeah, I'll just see them. Well, let's say forget the COVID era for a moment, right? Like, oh, I'll just see them at happy hour, or I'll see them over coffee or whatever. But then you don't like foster this connection. I find those kind of connections with people very difficult because there's not this like something that really compels me, right? When it's just so casual, or if it feels very one-sided. Right. I think the same thing about my professional network. Most of my network is I'm talking to them, offline, right? Like in my own private messaging. And the network that I've cultivated on LinkedIn is really meaningful to me because it's been done with care. And I reach out to people with personal messages and I say, hey, listen, I heard you talk once and you really inspired me because of A, B, and C. I just want to connect with you. I think you're very interesting. That's all. And I don't do that very frequently, but when I do, it feels impactful to me. It feels like I'm putting myself out there and trying to show someone who I am. And I respond very well to people who do the same. And I don't respond very well to like spammy messages or generic intros, or just clearly things that like have nothing to do with me or my background or my interests. Like if I get requests these days, like for advisory roles, for example, for like insurance companies, I'm like, dude, I don't know anything about insurance. Why would you want me to advise you? Like look at my background, right? So I think like cultivating a network with intention means that you'll have, like, I don't have a huge network, but that's really never been my goal. It's been to have a meaningful network. And I think that for me, that works really well. Yeah. You asked another part of that question and it's escaping me now.
I think you may have answered both, because the roles does your network play, and then how do you approach making new connections remotely? Which
I think that probably covers it.
Megan, thank you so much for all of your gems that you've been dropping throughout this entire conversation. It's been such a pleasure. I want to jump into some of these questions that the attendees have. Let's see. The first question. And thank you guys for putting the questions here. Remember to at Arc Team for any questions that you guys have coming up. And also, we're really excited. This is going to be the last conversation of the day. Tomorrow, we have a jam-packed day. We're going to be starting a little bit later, around 11:30 Pacific Standard Time, AM. So just be cognizant of that, guys. We also have the schedule on our reception board. So feel free to jump over there to see the updated times for the schedule for tomorrow as well. The first question is going to come from Christine, saying, I love what you're sharing. I'm curious if you can share more advice about how you actually discovered companies back when you were looking for a new home that matched your values. And did your network play a role in finding a place like Hotjar?
Thank you for the question, Christine. So I think that hopefully the tips on, for example, like people that I trust, looking at what kind of content they produce and the references they use and the analogies they use, examples they use of others' work. Like I mentioned, Marty Kagan and Lenny's newsletter. I feel bad. I really don't know his surname. he's well known enough. He's cultivated his own network meaningfully that he only needs one name. So yeah, I think like putting my trust in others and see, it's not, like I said, it's not a short-term play. I think it's a longer-term thing. But also on LinkedIn, like I think the nature of the network is very strong, but it can quickly become an echo chamber. And so I tend to seek folks out who have original thought and original, like, are just trying to not just beat a drum that everybody else has heard before, but are actually marching off in their own direction, right? Like who whose voices really resonate with me, and I want to hear more of what they have to say. And so I follow them. I find, that they're bringing up interesting brands when it comes to like the products themselves, because keep in mind, my discipline shapes a lot of this. So for product management, I'm always on product hunt, just looking at the latest out there, like even a handful of upvotes, and I'm like, dazzled by something. So I think like looking there, that's usually for earlier stage startups who are just trying to kind of establish product market fit. There are plenty of exceptions to that rule, by the way. But then doing some research there, like what products matter to me, which ones are mission driven, which ones have female founders, which ones are putting like diversity and inclusion, and not just that, but belonging and actually like walking the talk. Who's doing that? Because you can find the products often on Product Hunt or even on Reddit on like new product threads, and then go look them up. If what you can find out about them appears to be consistent with your values, it's a good place to start. But I must say, as you can tell, this is a hell of a lot more manual than just doing a job search elsewhere. So it in my opinion, it has worked for me because that intention is there. But it's really just a matter of priority for each person on what, you want to go to LinkedIn or some other really huge site with huge inventory of jobs, but it takes a really long time to filter out what you do and don't want from a people perspective and a mission-driven product perspective, or you're going to go the opposite route, which is a bit longer time. I always go the long haul.
Thank you for that. Gina asked a question. She says, Megan, your focus on embodying your values in your professional life really resonates with me. My question is around balancing your marketability with the opportunities are available. And to put it bluntly, if someone is in career transition or is doing a career pivot, they may not feel like they have a lot of options or leverage. How would you advise somebody in that situation? Perhaps you just emphasize certain points you've already made in this discussion, but maybe you'd give a bit different advice in this case.
Sure. So thank you, Gina, for this. I think in addition to what I've shared already, I can give you an example of where I did something that, if anybody, I'm not even going to tell you where to go, but if you can find me on YouTube, you'll see I have 3 videos, and one is a humiliating example of what I'm about to tell you, which is that when I was leaving Microsoft and trying again to make that pivot from technical project manager on large enterprise scale projects at a giant corporate into a seed stage startup in a product role. I mean, it was like nobody would talk to me, right? Like nobody was interested, I must say. And so I applied for a role. This isn't where I ended up working, but I applied for a role at a company called Plumfair. And I probably just gave you some evidence or like some hints on what to search on YouTube. And Plumfair was a really small startup of 10 or 15 people. And I'm not even going to go into their business model, but basically the role that was available was for business development. And I had never done anything like that and had to Google what that meant. To me, it sounded sales, blanketly, which is wrong, but whatever. And so they were a product that had launched in a couple different cities. It was a geography-based product. Mm-hmm. And I lived in Dallas, Texas at the time. I lived there for a year. And I drove around. I took 2 days off of work. And I drove around to like 15 different cafes and restaurants and told those cafes and restaurants that I worked for that startup Plumfair. And I pitched them. And I took videos on my phone of myself doing that and literally driving around Dallas. And then I used that as my application to Plumfair and said, hey, I've never done this role. I think your business is really cool. I also got you 3 new leads. So if you see people write you emails and refer to Megan, that was me, the crazy lady. Mm-hmm. And I want to join your team. Will you have a conversation with me? Wow. And I made it through to the final round interview. And that company ended up being acquired right away. And I would have worked there. Like anybody out there who was from Plumfair watching this in the ethers one day, I would have joined you for sure. But anyway, in terms of the pivot, it's hard. It's really hard. It wasn't easy for me then. And if I were to do it now, it probably wouldn't be easy. I think like my continuous thread of curiosity still stands true. I work in product now. I sure as hell hope I have many chapters and many more lives to live. I couldn't promise you I know what's in my future. Mm-hmm. But I just took the time and did the craziest, most bold thing I thought could make me possibly a more attractive candidate who had already done it before, because don't underestimate the power of being hungry. And so I think that's something I've tried to live and get really creative of showing.
And Megan, I know we're close on time, but this is going to be our last question for tonight. And the question is actually a really good one. It talks kind of about the management of your team and you working with them. It's from Britix. What are your go-to phrases while communicating with your team? Phrases that boost morale while giving feedback.
Cool. So I hope this is a good one for everyone. I cannot take credit in its originality, but I can take credit in using it very frequently, which is we have this concept in Hotjar called sushi feedback. And it's fresh, it's quick, and it's raw. So there's a lot of companies that talk about practicing radical candor. It's a book I very much recommend, by the way. That is gifted to every person when they join Hotjar, so that we can all get on the same page on the expectations around how we give and receive useful and applicable feedback. And sushi feedback does not come from that book, but it is a phrase that we say frequently. And the idea is that when someone does something, whether give a speech, I don't know, present something in a meeting, or go through an interview, like act as an interviewer for candidates, and you want to give them feedback, because being an interviewer is very difficult. And the onus on the interviewer to get the best out of the candidate is huge, by the way. So like feedback on the interviewer internally is extremely important. So we use the mechanism of sushi feedback all the time. So what we'll do, for example, is after one of those events that I just described to you, I might message a teammate and say, hey, do you have 5 minutes for, and then I literally put a little sushi emoji and then the word feedback. And then we get together and I say, hey, I want to talk you through this. You know, my best intentions are here. I really think you nailed these things. I really think we have to nail these other things next time. How are we going to do it? How can I support you? So I think like in terms of phrases that help, just the word sushi feedback makes it really lightweight, and it doesn't feel like so daunting. Like this is a performance review. You know, this feels like I'm here. I'm going to give this to you right now. It's going to be raw, but that's the point. I got to catch you in the moment. Otherwise it's going to be like, why'd you let that sit for 2 weeks and get stale? No, let's do it now. So I think that's one thing. And then in terms of boosting morale, I always relate feedback, whether positive or negative, to our core values. So if I feel like a decision was made that's very unclear, then I might say to someone on the team, or I hope that they say to me, by the way, this is not all about a one-way street. I hope they say to me, hey, Megan, I didn't feel like you were building trust with transparency, because I found out about this decision last minute and that really bothered me. Next time, here's what I'd like to see from you. So we refer to our core values and we ground that in feedback, positive or negative, all the time. It makes it so much easier. I told you guys about our performance reviews being based on how well we embody our core values. And it just makes it part of our like very natural, our modus operandi, not like some boxes to check.
Megan, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, Megan Murphy, VP of Product at Hotjar. Guys, give her some great sushi emojis. Give her some great clap emojis. Megan, it's been such a pleasure chatting with you today, and so grateful for all the tips that you've given our audience today. If anybody wants to connect with you or reach out to you, is there any way that you want to give them a Twitter feed or a LinkedIn page to do that?
Yeah, find me on LinkedIn. I'm one of many Megan Murphys, but I'm the only one at Hotjar.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Megan. And guys, take care.